Today I'm very honored to have Mr. Glenn Rhodes with us. He's the National Operations Director for EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Thank you so much for joining me today, Glenn.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Please tell me a little bit about your position at the task force and what you do and how it got started.
Yeah, well, the task force really got started as an offshoot of the EMP Congressional Caucus, and that's a group of representatives who decided that they would use the caucus as a national test ground for advocating grid resiliency to all threats to the grid. For example, EMP phenomenon, kinetic weapons, and other things, because our grid is pretty vulnerable to all those things. So Peter Pry was tasked by the Congress to hire the first EMP commission about 17 years ago, and they've been working feverishly ever since to try to harden the grid and try to raise public awareness on grid vulnerabilities. So Peter, at one point in time in the mid-2000s, decided that when the EMP Commission were to go, if the EMP Commission were to go away, that there needed to be a public advocacy group, and that's why he started a 501c3 group. It's based out of Herndon, Virginia, but the National Operations Center is here in Lakewood, Colorado. So that's why we're doing it. And my job is that since Peter was working on national legislation, trying to raise awareness in Congress and in the Senate and the House, he said, Glenn, we really need to have a grassroots movement that's more attuned to state and local efforts, because we feel like we've been blocked so many times at the national level to get grid legislation through, that maybe if we started to do a success story at regional levels, for example, the Front Range of Colorado or in Texas or California, that it would be an example of what the grid should really be like. So my job right now is to not only raise up national leadership in all 50 states, and by the way, if anybody's interested in joining our group, please visit emptaskforce.us and connect with us, and we can train you, and you could become an advocacy person and leader in your own particular state. We know that it's a critical, we're at a critical junction right now, so we have a very strong focus on the ABCs of EMP, both solar and weather, so you be educated, let's say, on the science and some of the policy matters that we're dealing with. So Peter said, go ahead, Glenn, let's start that national organization. So we're kind of the grassroots movement of the national effort to protect the grid.
And how is that going so far?
Well, the EMP Commission has been around for 17 years. They've made a number of recommendations to the government, and they haven't done one single thing, so it's not going too well. That's why efforts to do maybe a localized approach might be more successful. So we're feverishly trying to do that. Now in Texas, they tried to do some state legislation last year, which would have really helped the Texas grid, and it could have been a role model for everybody else, but they voted it down. The power companies are just not willing to, in some cases, not willing to accept the threat, not willing to acknowledge that the threat exists, or in other ways, for other and sundry reasons, don't want to really move on it. So it's kind of a discouraging thing.
Well, the power companies really have no incentive to make this happen.
Exactly.
It costs them a lot of money,
yeah,
and it brings down an awful lot of scrutiny on them as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I can certainly understand the resistance.
Yeah.
So what do you think we as citizens should do to move this cause forward?
Well, I think number one, I think we need to start educating ourselves in what the issues are. For example, the major threats from an electromagnetic phenomenon affect the big giant transformers. We have over 2,000 huge transformers. These are in the 400 to 300 ton range. They cost anywhere from $20,000 to $25,000 per ton. They're extremely hard to move, but not only that, if we ever had a grid down situation where we had to replace a large number of them, it would be almost impossible. They just take too long to make. take anywhere from 24 to 36 months lead time. And some of them are not even made in this country. So that's one vulnerability, kind of the backbone of our electrical power grid. The other vulnerability is the SCADA devices, and that SCADA stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Devices. And then there's millions of them throughout the network of power and other infrastructure systems throughout the United States and the world. And these little computer chips really provide a comm to switches and gears and other things that actually keep the infrastructure going. So the phenomenon would affect these little comm cards, and the problem is that every year they're made to operate with lower and lower voltages. So what happens is with the lower voltages that they need to operate, and because of cost savings and energy savings, it makes them more susceptible to an overcharge. And if you were to flash bang them with 20,000 volts or even 5,000 volts, they'd be fried. It's kind of akin to, remember when you take out a computer chip from your computer, it's always good to ground yourself because any static electricity could degrade the chips on the board. So if you can imagine something at 5,000 volts in comparison with just a little static electricity, that's kind of what we're up against. And many of these SCADA devices are found throughout the country. Some of them are in little, not even locked boxes. They're just, you just go up to them and you can just open up the box and take them right out. There's no security whatsoever in the well, I wouldn't say the vast majority of them, but many of them. So we need to be really careful when we address the SCADA devices, that we are able to harden them and from all hazards, and also protect them from sabotage. So those two things, I call them the backbone and the Achilles heel of the electrical power grid, are things that we need to do to get resilient on. And the way that again, in answer to your question, I kind of circumvent the thing, is that we need to understand more about the problem and the issues. Okay, so if they go to emptaskforce.us, they'd be able to find a call to action. That's about a 12-page document. They need to read through that, and it's our manifesto to say, guys, if you understand the threat, here's what you need to do. So understand about the phenomenon, then try to influence national or even state legislators in your own particular state to say, hey, let's create some things. They could look at our website, for example. If you go to that, you'd be able to connect with me and say, Glenn, can you download, or can you send me a link to download a copy of any state legislature that has tried to get a bill passed? And if they ask me for the Texas legislation, that would be a good role model for them to use and to share with their own state legislators to say, hey, I want a bill like Texas, because Texas is really a model for, let's forget about studying this thing because we've studied it to death for 17 years. Now is the time for action. So the Texas grid is a model for actually doing that.
That is wonderful news. I really, really can't thank you enough for sharing that with the world. So what in particular could we do to strengthen the SCADA systems? Should they be shielded with Faraday cages or more security measures? What steps could be taken to strengthen those SCADA systems?
I think for one thing, they need to be locked up.
For
just your ordinary person to go up to and open up and rip out the SCADA devices. But then second of all, there are technologies that are trying to come out that would secure the SCADA cards. So those are really critical, okay?
Are they expensive?
No. No, if you can harden every little SCADA card, that would be a low cost really to the infrastructure, but again, they're very vulnerable. To give you an example of how vulnerable these cards are, in San Bruno, California, they were doing a planned maintenance swap of an uninterruptible power supply, okay? So everything was planned, everything was prepared, and so when they went in to replace that uninterruptible power supply, which is necessary to keep the cards going, they inadvertently threw a switch that opened up the breaker that powers one of these cards, and the card in this particular case was used to test the overpressure of the natural gas pipe, the natural gas that was in the pipeline. When that failed, and let's say no natural pipeline or any pipeline is going to be completely sealed, okay? So if you have any little leak, when you get an overpressure, that's going to be exacerbated. And so what happened is it created a leak, and it ended up blowing up the whole neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And it destroyed, I don't know how many homes, a number of people were killed. And that was on a planned maintenance procedure. So you can imagine an unexpected pulse from either from the sun or from a high altitude EMP would fry those things. So SCADAs are very important to keep protected in our infrastructure.
So how about the transformers themselves? Is there any way that we can harden the actual transformers?
There are some ways that we can do it. I can't speak of the engineering, but I know that there is a company called Jackson Engineering that they could talk to. Imprimus up in, I believe they're up in Wisconsin, Minnesota, forget which state, but Imprimus is another company that has worked on transformers. They have a lot of expertise. There's some studies from Meditech and other things that they could ask me about, where they could start to understand how to the bottom line is how to protect the transformers. There are ways to do it. The trick is that if we could get transformers and other devices protected before they leave the drawing board, in other words, they're built into the system prior to leaving the manufacturing facility, that's our greatest chance of success, because it's too expensive to back engineer or to harden transformers that are already out there, although that's what we have to do to protect the ones that are out there right now. The bottom line is I always like to take paint a word picture, and that is, if an EMP were to go off and we were to try to rebuild the power grid system and rebuild transformers, it's akin to being a fireman and hearing the alarm go off and sliding down the pole, and the first thing you need to do is design your fire truck. Okay? Now think about how ridiculous that is. So you got to redesign your fire truck because it no longer works, and so that's kind of a good mental picture of where we're at.
Very good analogy. Thank you for that.
Grid.
Thank you for that visual. It really puts things in perspective. I have a question regarding back to the transformers. Would it make sense to have them connected to backup power systems such as wind or solar, or something that will be a good backup system in the event that the lights do go out, so they can keep us on?
Well,
would that be be effective? Would it work?
Those are all part of the shopping bag, if you will, of answers. So in the EMP Commission, we're aware that there could be a smorgasbord of solutions. We're not advocating one simple solution, because quite frankly the grid is complex, the grid is huge, it's the biggest machine ever made by mankind, and it's going to be imperative that we have more diversity in our solutions, we're going to have more resilience, just like biodiversity. If you have more organic systems in an ecosystem, you're going to have more diversity than having just one strain of wheat and it's destroyed by one bacteria. I mean, it just makes sense. So we're trying to do a whole shopping cart of different things. That's why we encourage Americans to be innovative in their solutions and things. I think the bottom line is, I think if I could have the magic wand to say, hey, let's sprinkle a little bit of knowledge on the green movement, which is kind of trying to mitigate global climate change, if you believe in that, mitigation, and trying to make for cleaner air and cleaner water. The thing that I would sprinkle onto that whole knowledge is saying, guys, we want renewable energies, we want geothermal, we want wind, we want solar, we want all these things, but let's add in the component of security. In other words, before that wind turbine leaves the manufacturing area, we want to make sure that it's hardened and protected from all the hazards that you could possibly imagine, to protect it. So then it maintains and powers through any catastrophic, well, what I term an extreme catastrophic electromagnetic event, or ECEE. And that helps with the whole future of the American power grid. There's one other thing I wanted to say is, as you know, there's a term that was coined in the Cold War called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And unfortunately, the Pentagon planners, when they started looking at the catastrophic event of an EMP on our infrastructure, they decided to put EMP in the same category as MAD. Well, that's was not really healthy, because they didn't plan on what are the steps to mitigate an EMP weapon happening, and as you know, there's an asymmetrical threat that's rising. So now you have the ability to have just a few people cause trillions of dollars worth of damage to the infrastructure. So instead of putting EMP into the MAD category, we like to put EMP into the SANE category, and that's what Dr. Peter Pry has termed SANE, S-A-N-E, which stands for Strategic Assured National Existence, which I think is a pretty good term. And we need to spread that word that we can do it, we can solve it. It's not a matter of building more weapons, it's a matter of building an infrastructure or infrastructures that are resilient to all hazards. So
it makes perfect sense to me,
yeah.
And I would call that sane. So really, the green movement needs to be actively engaged with the EMP strengthening movement.
Oh, exactly. And
yeah.
if we could get those two together, it will transform America.
Good to know. So Green Party, please pay attention to what we're talking about here. We need you.
Yes, we do. And one of the leading guys that's part of our group is Dr. Alexander Sandy McDonald. If you ever know anything about space weather, about NOAA's URSL lab, which is the Earth Research Science Lab. It's Sandy McDonald, an incredible guy here in Colorado, incredible asset to the United States, has always advocated learning more about everything. Okay, so he created this globe, if you will. It's about 10 feet in diameter, and it's got 4 projectors that project various weather patterns and everything. Well, Sandy is one of those unique anthropomorphic climate change type guys, okay, that has a nice sprinkling of security with his background. In other words, he was on the DMZ zone of North Korea, so he was able to say, hey, climate change is a big thing, but we also know he also has an appreciation for Kim Jong-un, and he could literally, we're at the point where Kim Jong-un could dismantle every single nuclear missile he has and only keep like 3 or 4 and still destroy America.
And he doesn't have to have pinpoint accuracy.
No, he doesn't.
Just a broad stroke could do a lot of damage.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So I don't think people are aware of that.
No, they're not. No.
Yeah.
So I think that we've covered a lot here,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that you were able to make it and join the show. So thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. That's great.
So again, this is Chey Barnes from Prepare Now TV. Thank you for joining us.